I agree with a lot of Trump's policies. I think he was the right president at the right time. But looking at the situation now, our country's in disarray, the world is on fire, and chaos follows him. And we can't have a country in chaos for 4 more years or we won't survive it.
I hear you say that a lot, chaos follows him. But is it chaos follows him or does he create the chaos? I mean, that sounds so passive. Chaos follows him.
I mean, rightly or wrongly, you call it whatever you want to call it, but when you feel it, it's chaos. When I tell these rooms that, they all nod their head. They get it. It's the chaos. And Americans are tired. They want government to work for them again. And they want to win.
All right. She also said that the media is exhausting. You guys are exhausting. That was ABC News Chief Washington correspondent Jonathan Karl pressing presidential candidate Nikki Haley on her messaging. As you heard there, Haley believes chaos follows the former president, quote, rightly or wrongly, but won't go further. And Jonathan Karl joins us now. He's the author of the new book, Tired of Winning, Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. See, what I find exhausting, Jonathan, is seeing Republican senators like Lindsey Graham or Republican presidential candidates like Nikki Haley failing to point out the threat of Trump to the very people they either serve or want to serve.
I mean, I had several different questions with her about this very point. And I asked her at one point about a statement that she made shortly after January 6th, where she was absolutely, without any hesitation, criticizing Trump, condemning him for what had happened, and going so far as to say that we made a mistake in following him. We must never let that happen again. And I asked, do you still believe that? And she said yes. But in the course of the answer, she also repeated what she has so often said, and you heard there, where she says he was the right president for the right time. But wait a minute, he was president on January 6th. And she, so she's really trying to walk this line. She's trying, on one hand, she's got to obviously beat Trump if she's going to get the nomination. He's far and away the front runner, but she's clearly reluctant to say anything that would anger Trump's base supporters, which she wants to ultimately be her base supporters.
And the right president at the right time. I mean, for who? I guess for people who got tax cuts, but not for people who died of COVID. Tens of thousands of people who died of COVID and perhaps could have been told a lot sooner about the danger. I mean, we could go on for 4 hours, Jonathan, about his presidency. I mean, I don't know, how does Nikki Haley look the voters in the eye and say she's being honest when she says something like that?
Well, look, I think you can debate over and over again all of the things you just mentioned about the Trump presidency.
Yes.
The reason why I wrote Tired of Winning is because I actually believe the evidence is there that whatever you thought of Trump 1.0, 2.0 will be far more extreme. That the policies that he is talking about implementing, that the people around him, that the whole basis of his campaign is actually on a different level than what we saw in 2016 and 2020. And when I asked Nikki Haley about that, I asked about his central campaign theme, this idea of retribution. Trump says, I am your retribution. He talks about using the power of the government to destroy his enemies. When I asked her about that is when she said, you guys are exhausting. You media, you're exhausting. You only want to talk about Trump. But this is an important point because, yes, we've gone over we've talked endlessly about what happened during the Trump presidency for good reason, but there's actually, I think, been not enough attention paid to what a second Trump presidency would be and how, in many ways, it goes far beyond what we saw the first time around.
Jonathan, as you talk to Governor Haley and others running, do you think that, watching your interview, that she's trying to cautiously deal with Trump and not really attack some of the real venom that he's expressed and that he's using to rally his base to vote for him, such as when he praises dictators and rulers or makes outright racist statements, she kind of never attacks that. It's that, that it always follows him, some kind of confusion, and whatever term she uses follows him. But the core of his message is very fascist and bigoted, and I don't hear her or any of his opponents attacking that.
I mean, with the exception of Chris Christie, who has done that. But yes, I mean, and she did in the course of the interview. To be fair, she was quite harshly critical of him for praising dictators. But on that larger question of his use of blatantly fascistic imagery and racist imagery, the idea of poisoning the bloodstream, the idea of rooting out the vermin, describing his political opponents as vermin, none of them want to go there. None of them want to touch it. And again, I think what it is, I think there are two things. And you're hinting at one, which is his retribution, his personal retribution, the way he will go out and set out to destroy people who take him on. But also, she looks out and she sees the hold that Trump has on the base of the Republican Party, and she says, I need to get those people if I'm going to win. I need to get those people, and I can't get those people if I am seen as going too far against Donald Trump. But, I mean, clearly the idea of holding back has not worked.
So, Jonathan, we heard from Governor DeSantis in recent days suggest that if Trump were to lose in Iowa or New Hampshire or anywhere else, he wouldn't accept that, to which we can all say, yeah, we know. That's how this has been set up all along. He hinted at it in 2016, and then he did it in 2020. But for those that you talk to, both in Trump's orbit but outside of it, among other Republicans, are they taking any steps to prepare for that eventuality? Or conversely, what is it going to look like come next November, where we get a Trump-Biden rematch? Trump loses again, or what recourse do we have to prevent him? I mean, he's not president anymore, but he's sure going to stir up his followers, and who knows what might happen.
Well, I mean, the point that you just made there, that he's not president anymore, is incredibly important, obviously. As president, he was able to use the power of that office to attempt to overturn the election. Fortunately, he failed because many of the people who worked for him refused to do what he directly ordered. I mean, he wanted to use the power of the Justice Department to pressure the states to overturn their election results. He wanted the Department of Homeland Security, also DOJ, but the Department of Homeland Security, as I reported, he wanted Chad Wolf, the acting secretary, to use the Department of Homeland Security to seize voting machines after the DOJ refused to go along with his orders. He was infuriated when the leaders of the Army, the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Secretary of the Army, put out a statement in December of 2020 saying that the military has no role in determining the outcome of a presidential election. In other words, that the U.S. military won't take part in a coup. It infuriated him, and those two leaders were threatened with losing their jobs if they repeated it. So he doesn't have any of that anymore. If he did get elected again, I think that the assumption you have to make is that the people that stopped him the first time around would not be in a second Trump administration. They wouldn't be there to resist what he was demanding. They would be there to follow orders. That's the significant difference. But look, Jonathan, if he refuses to accept the results this time around, the fear would be, will there be violence in the country? But he won't, and that's a real fear, but he won't have the power of the presidency.
Jonathan Karl, thank you. It's always great to have you on the show. Jonathan's new book is entitled Tired of Winning, Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. Thanks very much for coming on this morning. And